Rails also has select option form helpers that are specially designed for working with dates and times. In web development, it can be extremely tedious to take a date and time and to break it up into 5 or 6 different select option tags, generate the options for each one, and also determine which option should be currently selected. Then, once the parameters are submitted, then we also have to take all those parameters and reassemble them into a date again before we submit them to the database. Fortunately, the Rails helpers make this process much easier. We're going to look at the 3 main helpers. There's date select, time select, and then the combination of the two, date time select. Date select is when we're only working with a date or when we don't care about the time. We just want to have whatever default time set, which will typically default to midnight. The date select will work just like select did, but it will generate 3 different select option tags in a row, one for the year, one for the month, and one for the day. We don't have to pass in any choices to it like we did with the select helper because Rails knows what choices to offer when it's building those tags. For the month, it uses the 12 months of the year. For the day, it uses the 31 possible days that someone could select in a month. For the year, it defaults to 5 years in the past and 5 years in the future, and we can change it if we want to pass in something to the options hash. Let's take a look at some of those options. So as I said, we can pass in the start year and the end year. I've shown you what the defaults are there. The order will determine what order these 3 different select option tags ought to appear. By default, it's going to be year, month, day, but it's very common. You might want to rearrange it to month, day, and year. If we're not interested in the year, the month, of the day, we also have the ability to say discard year true, and it will just not include that one. And we have an include blank option like we had with select. We also have a prompt option, which instead of just being a blank option, will give you the name of what you're going to be picking. So it'll say month at the top of the month one, year at the top of the year one. It'll just give you a label by passing in prompt true. There's a few other choices using the month numbers, adding the numbers to go with the name of the month, or using a short month name. And then last of all, we have the date separator. What should separate those? By default, there's no separator, but you could put a slash, for example, if you wanted to separate the different fields by a slash. The next helper is the time select, which works the exact same way, except that we're only picking time. By default, it's only going to include the hour and the minutes, but we can have it include the seconds if we pass that in as an option. And we can choose the minute step, which is how many minutes should we jump as we go through. By default, it's going to be every minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 60. But we could jump every 5 minutes so that we have 5, 10, 15, or every 10 minutes, or every 15 minutes. You can configure that. Once again, we have include blank and prompt as options, and then the time separator if you want to specify that. And date time works the same way, except we're interested in both the date and the time. So by default, it's going to output 5 different fields, 3 for the date, 2 for the time, and then we can use all of those same above options, and we also have the additional option of the date time separator, what character ought to go in between the date and the time. I'd like to try these out, in particular the date time select, and the place that I want us to try it is with our created at and updated at fields. Those are date time fields that we have in our database already. Now typically you wouldn't actually allow these to be editable values. You wouldn't put them on the form. You would just let Rails quietly manage them in the background. There would be no need for the user to change them. The date that it's created at is the date that it was created. We don't need to modify that. And the date that's updated will get constantly updated. We don't need to worry about that either. But for demonstration purposes, I want us to go in and add those fields just so that you can get familiar with it and see how they work. So let's start by going into our views for our subjects and into form. So here at the bottom of the form, I'm just going to paste in a new date time select for created at. So just very simple, created at, it's going to be a date time select. Let's see what it gives us by default. Just save that page. Let's launch our web server, Rails server. And let's switch over to Firefox, localhost 3000 subjects. So it gives us our subjects list, and I'll just click edit on the initial subject. So there we go. That's what it gives us by default. We have the year, and it gives us 5 years in the past and 5 years in the future as default options. We can configure that. It gives us the months of the year. It gives us just the full name by default, but we can configure that. And then it gives us the days of the month, which goes all the way up to 31. Now you may be wondering, so what happens if someone enters an invalid date? For example, what if you enter February 31st, which doesn't exist? Well, what Rails will do for you is convert that into a real date, which would be something like March 2nd or March 3rd. It'll actually say, oh, if I went X number of days past the date that's available, what would that date be? Now that's its default behavior. If you don't want it to do that, then you'll have to write something in your code to behave differently. And then I've got the hours, which will be what I call military time. It goes from 0 to 23. And then the number of minutes. And I didn't do any step for it, so it has 0 to 59 minutes. So feel free to play around with the options that you pass in yourself. I'm going to just put in a real simple one here, which is order. I think that's pretty useful to have. And we'll put in the month, the day, and the year. We'll do it in that format and just save it. Let's go over here and try it. And you'll see that it flips it around. So now it's April 29th, 2010 instead. Before we move on, there's something very important that I want to show you, which is how Rails handles all of these different forms. So if we go to View, Page Source, then you can view the source. And let's scroll down here to where we have the first subject created at. And first of all, I want you to appreciate how much it actually saves you. Scroll down so that you just see all of the different options that it gives you. And it saves you from having to create all of those. But the second thing that I want you to see is what name it gives to each of these fields. Subject created at, and then in parentheses, 2i. This one is 3i. If we come down here, this one is 1i, 4i, 5i. So they're all numbered. And what happens is when the parameter is received by Rails, Rails says, oh, I noticed that there's some parentheses in that parameter name. Therefore, I'm going to assume that it must be part of a multi-parameter assignment, essentially a date that has been broken up. And therefore, I'm going to try and rebuild it. And I'm going to rebuild it in the order that they're numbered. Part 1i, part 2i, part 3i, and so on. And that's how I'll be able to rebuild the date from these multiple parameters. So it's a special name. So I just want you to pay attention to that. The helper actually creates a slightly different name for each of these select tags than any of the other helpers that we've been looking at, because it's essentially taking one thing and breaking it up into many parts. Rails handles it in the background for you, so you don't ever have to fool with it. But I just want you to know that it's there and understand what it's doing. Now, of course, all of these helper methods that we've been looking at so far all depend on having an object, our subject, for example, that we're working with. But there are also generic versions of all of these tags that don't require that we have an actual object to work with. They'll just help us to write some very simple HTML. In the next movie, we'll take a look at those.